Europe is not preparing for war with China. It is preparing for what could happen before any war even begins. A single disruption in the Taiwan Strait could cut off over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, and Europe has no backup. So why did it take 3 separate crises for policymakers to finally act? The answer did not start with China. It started with a pipeline. For decades, European foreign policy rested on a simple theory: expanding trade would stabilize global politics. When China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, European member state trade ministries and corporations saw an open door. Under the pure logic of cost-cutting, companies shifted manufacturing eastward, slashing costs while building a highly concentrated supply chain. By 2019, China had risen to become the European Union's second-largest trading partner, while the EU became China's largest. Why this matters? This massive commercial connection occurred under the assumption that trade and national security could remain entirely separate. It was an economic triumph, but it silently created unprecedented strategic exposure. The first formal acknowledgement of this exposure came on March 12, 2019. The European Commission issued a strategic outlook that fundamentally redefined the relationship. No longer just a commercial ally, Beijing was officially designated as a cooperation partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. The old assumption had cracked, setting off a quiet revolution in how Europe views its economic dependencies. In February 2022, theory became reality. For years, European energy policy operated on a calculated gamble. Cheap Russian natural gas would fuel continental industry while binding Moscow to Western markets. On the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, the European Union relied on Russia for 40% of its imported gas, with the Nord Stream pipelines carrying more than 60% of that supply. When Moscow cut the valves, this exposure fractured the economic architecture. Pipeline imports plummeted by 41%, triggering record inflation, soaring utility bills, and idling factories. Why this matters? The crisis proved that integrated trade is not a shield against aggression. It is a vector for coercion. European capitals scrambled to buy liquefied natural gas and build emergency terminals. But the true transformation was psychological. If a sudden geopolitical shock could dismantle Europe's energy supply overnight, what other massive, quiet dependencies were waiting to fail next? At the center of this modern strategic equation lies a single island, Taiwan. While headlines focus on military maneuvers, European economists look at industrial survival. Taiwan's foundries control over 50% of the global contract chip-making market and nearly all of the most advanced semiconductors. These microchips power everything from French hospital equipment and German cars to regional telecommunications networks. During the pandemic, a minor supply bottleneck cost the global automotive industry $210 billion, forcing companies like Volkswagen and Stellantis to idle lines and cut production. Why this matters? If a temporary pandemic delay could freeze assembly lines across Bavaria, a permanent closure of the Taiwan Strait would halt European manufacturing entirely. This realization shifted the debate in Brussels. The threat in East Asia is not just a distant geopolitical clash. It is an immediate threat to domestic factories. But identifying the bottleneck is only the first step. The real struggle is figuring out how to build a shield against it without triggering the very crisis Europe is trying to avoid. To shield its economy, Europe is not cutting ties with China. Instead, Brussels is pioneering a strategy called de-risking. While decoupling would mean a complete economic withdrawal, de-risking aims to keep trade open while systematically eliminating single-point vulnerabilities. Why this matters? This represents a fundamental shift from prioritizing cheap, just-in-time efficiency to securing just-in-case resilience. Under this new doctrine, industrial supply chains are no longer viewed as purely commercial matters. European policymakers are folding critical sectors, including semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, energy, and telecommunications, directly into national security planning. To secure these areas, governments are incentivizing nearshoring and friendshoring, actively moving production closer to home or to allied nations. This security strategy accepts a hard economic truth. Higher manufacturing costs are a price worth paying to guarantee industrial continuity. But rebuilding these complex supply chains takes years, and Europe's immediate vulnerabilities remain exposed. This vulnerability extends far beyond chips to the raw materials that build them. While mining lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths happens worldwide, China processes the vast majority into industrial-grade inputs. Why this matters? Controlling processing capacity, rather than raw extraction, gives Beijing immediate leverage over Europe's green transition and defense manufacturing. To break this hold, the European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act sets hard 2030 targets: mining 10%, recycling 25%, and processing 40% of its strategic materials domestically. But materials are only half the equation. The high-end machinery that prints the circuits is just as vital. The Netherlands holds an outsized position in the global supply chain, maintaining a near monopoly on advanced semiconductor lithography tools. As Washington tightens export controls on these machines, European manufacturers face a difficult choice between American security demands and their largest commercial buyer. This technological squeeze forces European policymakers to look beyond supply chains, shifting their focus toward protecting the critical physical networks that keep the continent connected. On the ground, this strategy translates into a massive return of state-guided industrial policy. European governments are pouring billions into domestic factories, subsidizing clean technology, battery plants, and semiconductor fabs. They are actively funding excess capacity and building emergency stockpiles of chips and critical minerals in high-security warehouses. Why this matters? To secure supply chains, Europe is choosing to pay higher production costs at home rather than risk cheaper, vulnerable imports. At the same time, the defense shield has expanded to the systems that run daily life. Under updated laws like the NIS2 and Critical Entities Directives, European regulators now treat ports, energy grids, cloud systems, and artificial intelligence as critical assets. Mandatory screening rules block foreign buyers from purchasing stakes in telecom networks or maritime hubs, while cyber defense teams monitor infrastructure for state-sponsored malware. This physical and digital fortification is transforming the state's role in the marketplace, but it raises a challenging question. What happens when these newly secured systems are put to the ultimate test? This systemic fortification faces a difficult geopolitical limit. Europe is caught between two superpowers. While Brussels relies on Washington for its military shield under NATO, Beijing remains an indispensable trading partner. This double dependency prevents Europe from simply picking a side. Instead, the pursuit of strategic autonomy is a slow, compromise-driven process. Internal debates split member states between maintaining industrial competitiveness and building security resilience. Why this matters? European policy cannot be revolutionary. It must be incremental. The goal is a delicate balancing act, staying open to global trade without staying exposed to sudden geopolitical shocks. Inside government offices, crisis planners and logistics authorities are mapping out scenarios they hope never occur. They are preparing for low-probability, high-impact events like sudden shipping blockades in the Taiwan Strait or coordinated cyber attacks on ports. Under the Integrated Political Crisis Response Framework, industrial risk managers are calculating how long strategic reserves of microchips would last if supply lines vanished overnight. Why this matters? This is not an anticipation of war, but a calculated exercise in risk management. By building physical safety nets now, Europe aims to protect its factories from sudden global shocks. The old efficiency-first economic model no longer guarantees safety. For 30 years, globalization prioritized the lowest possible cost, operating on a fragile, just-in-time delivery system. Today, Europe is building a just-in-case safety net. Why this matters? This represents a strategic economic rewiring rather than isolation, or the end of international trade. By binding commerce, energy, technology, and national defense together, European states are adapting globalization to survive an unstable geopolitical era. Even if a major trade cutoff in East Asia never happens, this quiet preparation is already permanently reshaping the global economic system. Europe's quiet pivot is rewriting the rules of global trade. Today, the ultimate vulnerability is no longer market competition, but strategic dependence. In an unstable world, the price of resilience is a cost Europe can no longer avoid. Share your thoughts below.